Welcome back, everyone. If you're looking to master the skeletal framework of the head, you are in exactly the right place. In today's explainer, we're going to get human skull anatomy explained simply, directly, and visually. We're breaking down these complex structures into a clear, logical flow so everything just kind of clicks into place. Let's get right into it.
But hey, before we map out the whole system, I've got a quick question to test your instincts. Think about all the parts of your head for a second. What do you think is the only movable bone in your entire skull? Take a second, lock in your guess.
Okay, ready? If you guessed the lower jaw, you hit the nail on the head. This is the mandible. You see, most bones of the skull are completely immobile, locked tightly together like a giant puzzle. The mandible is literally the singular movable piece of this whole setup. It connects to the rest of the skull right at the temporal mandibular joints, acting as this mechanical lever that lets us speak and chew.
Now, zooming out from the jaw for a second, let's look at the sheer scale of what we're actually dealing with here. The human skull is composed of 22 major bones, and honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the complexity of our head, because if we also count the tiny auditory ossicles hidden deep in your ears, plus the hyoid bone in your neck, that number actually jumps all the way up to 29.
All right, so let's kick things off with Section 1. Meet the human skull, a macro to micro tour. So, at the highest level, the primary function of your skull is to act as the ultimate biological armor, right? It provides crucial protection for your brain and sensory organs. To really understand how those 22 bones pull this off, anatomists divide them into two massive functional groups. On one side, we have the neurocranium, which is basically a heavily armored brain case that protects your mind. And on the flip side, we have the viscerocranium, which is the facial skeleton that forms your features and gives you your unique face. Visually, these two zones anchor together perfectly. Look at this purple section. That's the neurocranium, creating a literal protective vault out of 8 distinct bones. And then, sitting right below and in front of it, is the orange section. That's the visceral cranium, acting as a facial scaffold made up of the remaining 14 bones.
Moving right along to Section 2, the neurocranium, your brain's vault.
So, the really crucial point here is understanding exactly how this highly secure, reinforced vault is constructed. If we break down the 8 bones that make up this brain vault, we find a very specific structural pattern. 4 of these are unpaired bones that run straight down the center, like the frontal and occipital bones. The remaining 4 consist of 2 paired sets, specifically the parietal and temporal bones, and these form the robust sides and roof of the skull.
Let's look at a key player in this vault. This right here is the frontal bone. As the name suggests, it forms your forehead, but it also curves underneath to form the roofs of your eye orbits. Think of it as a super thick, robust front shield protecting the frontal lobes of your cerebrum. And it even houses these air-filled cavities known as the frontal sinuses.
But here's where it gets really interesting. If we move away from that thick shield at the front and start looking at the sides of the skull, we find some of the absolute most intricate architecture in the entire human body. Check out the temporal bone. It looks somewhat irregular on the outside, sure, but internally, it is an incredibly complex structure. These paired bones don't just form the sides of your cranial base, they actually house your middle and inner ears. That means your vital hearing and vestibular organs are completely encased right inside this very bone. Crazy, right?
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, the base and landmarks. Basically, the skull's cable management. To make all these separate bones work together as one single protective unit, they need joints, and they need routing channels for all our internal wiring. Let's start with the joints. The bones of the skull are joined together by sutures. Now, unlike your knees or your elbows, sutures are fibrous joints with this really distinct, jagged, fracture-like appearance. They lock the immobile bones of the skull together tightly, acting pretty much like rigid, unmoving biological zippers.
Next up, we have foramina. Because the skull is essentially a sealed vault, the body needs a reliable way to pass biological cables in and out. Foramina are these tiny canals and openings scattered throughout the skull bones. They act as super precise pathways that allow your essential nerves and blood vessels to safely enter and exit the cranial cavity.
To really visually anchor this concept, just look at the occipital bone at the base of the skull. See that massive hole? That is the foramen magnum. It is literally the grand exit pathway of the skull. The basilar part of the occipital bone right in front of it actually supports the medulla oblongata, which just goes to show how perfectly these openings cradle our most critical neurovascular structures.
Okay, let's shift gears to Section 4, the viscerocranium, or the facial scaffold.
Now, shifting to the 14 bones of the facial skeleton, a really perfect example of functional design here is the maxilla. This scaffold doesn't just give us our distinct human faces, it actually houses the initial parts of both our digestive and respiratory tracts. The maxilla forms the central aspect of your face and upper jaw, and it holds your upper teeth for chewing. But it also contains these large, air-filled maxillary sinuses that help warm the air you breathe and give your voice its completely unique resonance.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground today, but this next part is often completely misunderstood. When we look at the skull as a whole, male and female skulls are actually distinctly different from one another.
Let's explore that in Section 5, Sexual Dimorphism, Male versus Female Skulls.
So, in human anatomy, the term sexual dimorphism simply means that certain physical traits differ based on sex. And these differences aren't just random. They are largely driven by skeletal robustness, overall bone thickness, and the actual size of muscle attachment sites. Let me guide you through this side-by-side comparison real quick. Over on the left, we have a female skull, which generally features a narrower, more pointed chin. Then on the right, the male skull typically exhibits a broader, squarer chin. You can really see how the overall proportions and forms subtly shift.
This table here breaks down some of those key markers. For instance, males typically have larger mastoid processes behind the ears, more rugged nuchal lines on the back of the skull for muscle attachment, and a heavier, more robust mandible in general. However, it is so important to remember that these traits absolutely exist on a spectrum, and they can vary significantly from person to person.
So, to wrap up today's explainer, here are your 3 key takeaways. First off, the skull is an absolute marvel of engineering, composed of 22 main bones. Second, it's divided functionally into the highly protective neurocranium vault and the viscerocranium facial scaffold. And third, human skulls exhibit this totally fascinating sexual dimorphism through varied bone thickness and muscle attachments. I really want to thank all of you focused learners for joining me today. If you appreciate clear, visually driven learning that gets straight to the point, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button for more simple medical explanations. It really helps the channel grow and lets us keep making these deep dives for you. But before you go, I want to hear from you. What did you find most surprising about the skull today? Was it the fact that only your jawbone actually moves? Or maybe those subtle differences between male and female skulls? Let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next explainer.